everyone, Aaron here from Rudy Visuals. Lovely to see you all again and hope everyone is doing well. In today's video, we are talking all about Sony mirrorless cameras and specifically 5 pros of shooting on the system, and to balance things out, 5 cons as well. This is from the point of view of a hybrid shooter recording video as well as photography. So we've been shooting pretty much exclusively with Sony full frame mirrorless cameras for the past 3-4 years now, and currently shoot with the Sony a7S III, the a7R III and the a7 III. Now before we get into this list, I do want to stress that there is no such thing as a perfect camera, only cameras that are better suited for specific needs and specific people. And at the end, every camera system is going to have their own ups and downs. This is not also the be all and end all. This is just my personal opinion, but I would love to know what you're shooting on and what pros and cons you've experienced while using your cameras. So let us know down there in the comment section below. Anyways, enough waffling, let's get straight into the pros. So right off the bat, I have to say that lens choice is a really big pro of using Sony. So not only do you have a fantastic array of first party lenses, as long as you're prepared to sell a few grandparents' kidneys or a bank, there's also just a huge array of now like third party lenses, from big hitters like Sigma to more budget friendly options like Tamron, Samyang's, and even companies like Viltrox now. There's really something for everyone and something for every budget, so it's definitely a massive advantage when you're thinking about shooting with Sony cameras. Moving on to number 2, next up is the actual range of camera bodies themselves. So this Sony Alpha range just seems to be constantly growing every single year, with bodies that range from high-end sports cameras like the A9, high-end video cameras like the S3 and the FX series, and high-resolution still beasts like the R range, and hybrid cameras like the a7 IV. That's not even getting into the range of cheaper but still impressive crop sensor mirrorless bodies as well. It can be kind of a little bit daunting at first when you're first kind of getting into the Sony ecosystem, but it is just fantastic from my point of view that there's a camera body that's going to be geared for whatever your specific need is and what your budget is as well. So that's just a great thing to have. At number 3, it's the excellent autofocus across the range. Now for me, the dual pixel AF system on Canon cameras, it's still really the gold standard when it comes to AF performance. And in the early days of Sony mirrorless, it definitely felt like the gap was still, it was still pretty big. But these days, honestly, it's almost neck and neck. I almost feel like the latest Sony cameras for the past 2, even 3 generations now, they're pretty much on par, especially when you factor in, the amazing eye autofocus performance, face detect, face registration. It pretty much just locks onto your subjects. There's, animal IF as well. Honestly, it's just so reliable that I don't think I've ever used manual focus this past year, maybe 2 years. Whether it's for video, photo, there's a myriad of focusing options as well to choose from that just makes your job so much easier so that you can focus on the fun part of creating. So moving on to the next pro, and that is the pretty astounding low light performance. Now when I first switched from the Canon 80D and the 60 Mark II to the a7 III, the difference between shooting indoors or at night, it was literally like night and day, the difference. So being able to bump up your ISO like, into the tens of thousands on my a7S III and still get a super clean video is still so crazy to me, even when it does get a little bit grainy because of, the 10-bit video and 4K resolution. Throw a little bit of denoiser on there and voila, it's super clean. But even on entry-level bodies like the a7 III, the low light and ISO performance is still so impressive, especially if you're coming from a DSLR. Which leads me nicely onto my final pro, which is the color science. Now this is going to be more of a subjective opinion. Some people might put color science in the cons. It's kind of a preference from person to person, and I kind of definitely agree with the general consensus that, for example, Canon typically looks great straight out of the camera, whether that's for video or photo. But I also do feel like Sony, like with its autofocus, has really improved a huge amount over the past few years, particularly with its latest generation of cameras. So we shoot a lot of portraiture with a variety of different models from all different backgrounds. And one thing we always notice is just how great skin tones look, whether it's shooting someone with lighter skin or with darker skin. And if it's not exactly perfect straight out of the camera, it only takes just a little bit of tweaking to get it looking great. Now the auto white balance can sometimes give you a strange results in terms of like the tinting of skin, but typically I don't ever shoot with auto white balance anyway, whether it's for video or photo. And when talking about video, of course, there's the range of picture profiles now, like S-Log, Cinephore, and the new S-Cinetone, which is what I actually use most of the time now at work. It just looks really nice straight out of camera and doesn't require a whole lot of color grading. And with more of the newer lineup of cameras now featuring 10-bit video, you've got even more flexibility when it comes to color correction and color grading. So with the pros out of the way, let's now move on to the 5 cons. So first up for me, it has to be the ergonomics. This may sound like a weird thing to complain about when it comes to cameras, but it is something that you're gonna be holding and using for extensive periods, you know, sometimes even hours at a time, all day in fact. And it is something that is actually really important. So for me, it's the kind of like the less rounded edges of the camera bodies and the grip, which to me, it's just not as comfortable as it maybe should be. That's especially noticeable when you hold a Canon or a Nikon body, for example. The difference is really, really noticeable. I end up getting kind of like weird pains in my hands and knuckles after extended use, which I never really got when shooting with Canon bodies. Over time, I have kind of just gotten used to it, but then I'll pick up like a 5D or a R5 or whatever, and I can instantly feel how much just nicer those bodies feel in comparison. So just something that I think does need to be mentioned. Next up is the cost. Now, to be honest, you could probably make this criticism about all of the major camera companies now, but I do feel like the newest models from Sony are always on the kind of eye-watering cry for my bank account levels of expensive, and they tend to stay pricey even on the used market for a good few years until kind of newer models come out to replace them. You've then got to factor in high-end, you know, memory cards, extra batteries, accessories. I mean, look at this XLR converter for the A7S3. Why on earth is it that expensive? And don't expect to be able to afford high-end first-party lenses either, unless you're willing to sell your house and maybe a couple kids as well. Next up, you probably knew this was coming, but it is the screens. So firstly, most of the Sony full-frame bodies don't have proper flip-out screens. It's changing now with some of the new models like the S3, A7 IV, and the R5, I believe, but most of them just have these kinds of screens. They're not terrible by any means, but when you're used to a proper flip LCD screen, it does beg the question why Sony just doesn't include them on all cameras since the very beginning. They are just so much better and more convenient. And the other issue with regards to the screens is that, is it just me, or is the actual quality of the screens generally across the range just not all that great? Again, they're not terrible, but I just find they aren't quite as sharp and as color accurate as the screens found on Canons, for example. Sometimes, you know, the color looks great on the screen, then you just put it on a monitor or take it back to your computer and it just didn't look how the screens told you it did. And I know the screens differ from camera to camera, but I've yet to use a Sony body where I thought to myself, wow, this screen is awesome. You know, they've always just been kind of mediocre to me. At number 4, it's the battery life. Again, this is another issue that affects all mirrorless cameras, to be honest, regardless of brand, especially compared to DSLR cameras. And to be fair, battery life on mirrorless cameras, they are getting better and better all the time. Honestly, this is not a major complaint, but for instance, when I'm shooting, for example, 4K videos, 10-bit 42 on an A7S III, like when I shoot interviews, that battery from full is gone in like maybe an hour. Even on my A7 III, which is shooting 8-bit, that battery still goes down pretty quickly. It's not so much of an issue for me now when we take photos, for example. We could be in a studio all day doing portraits and I don't really notice it as much. But for video work, I definitely always carry as many of these batteries as I possibly can, just because I'm aware of how quickly that battery can drain. And last but not least, another one you probably knew was coming, it is the menu system. I mean, just look at this mess. I know this is much improved now on the newer cameras, thankfully, but even these are still, in my opinion, they're a work in progress. They're not perfect. You compare that to Canon, for example, you know, their UI and menu system is just so much better in the way everything is organized and laid out. Now, for me, I've been using Sony's for a while, so I've gotten used to them, but if you're a newcomer, honestly, this is enough to just put you off straight away. It doesn't matter how good the camera specs and the image quality is. If you don't know how to change settings and how to find specific options in the menu, etc., you're just not gonna want to use it. So yeah, there's something else there. It's definitely worth mentioning. Now, I am conscious that this is getting to be quite a long video now, and I could probably get into even more legacy issues like, you know, rolling shutter performance, maybe the build quality, the lack of weather sealing at the bottom of some models. But I think we'll stick with those 5 cons for now. There's probably more pros as well that I probably missed. I could go into more detail, but I think I'll stick with those that I have. So there you have it, 5 pros and 5 cons of shooting with Sony. Now again, every camera ecosystem is gonna have their own issues and advantages, but I do hope this video has helped you in some way if you're thinking about making the switch, or if you're already on Sony. Did this convince you to stay, or maybe did I convince you to change? You know, for those of you who've made it this far, I'd love to know what you're shooting on right now, and let me know down there in the comments what pros and cons you found with your camera. Anyway, let's end it there. Like and subscribe, follow us on socials, all that good stuff. And yeah, I guess I'll see you on the next one. Thanks again, peace.